Last night was round 2 of the Democratic debates in Miami. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and Bernie Sanders were a part of those final 10 candidates who faced off out of the 20 who debated, and more than 20 that have now announced. Now, Senator Harris was among those going after the frontrunner and former Vice President Joe Biden on race and other issues.
It was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of 2 United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing.
It's a mischaracterization of my position across the board. I did not praise racist. That is not true, number one. Number two, if we want to have this campaign litigated on who supports civil rights and whether I did or not, I'm happy to do that.
That was just one of many fiery moments. Jessica Smith joins us from Washington, D.C. Jess, what did you think of night 2?
Yeah, night 2 was a lot more heated than the first night. We saw the candidates being very aggressive. They realized the first night that interrupting works, so they did it quite a bit. We saw Senator Sanders kind of calm everyone down at one point, saying that the American people don't want to see a food fight. And I think it's pretty unanimous here in Washington, at least among people who are watching this, that Senator Harris was really a standout in this debate with that moment, talking to former Vice President Joe Biden. But the economy was also really in focus last night. There were a lot of different issues that the candidates touched on, including the president's tax cuts. They talked about how they would roll back those tax cuts. They also talked about how they would try to make the economy work for everyone. And we did finally get a question on trade. 3 of the candidates were asked what they would do to stand up to China. Mayor Pete Buttigieg said that the president is focused on the trade imbalance with China right now, while China is focused on preparing for the future. He said U.S. trade policy right now looks chaotic. Take a listen.
And if you look at what China is doing, they're using technology for the perfection of dictatorship. But their fundamental economic model isn't going to change because of some tariffs. I live in the industrial Midwest. Folks who aren't in the shadow of a factory are somewhere near a soy field where I live. And manufacturers, and especially soy farmers, are hurting.
So they all agreed they don't like how the president is going about this, but we didn't really hear a lot of specifics about what they would do instead. Buttigieg says he wants to invest domestically in things like education and infrastructure to allow the U.S. to compete with China. Andrew Yang just said tariffs are not the answer. And then Senator Bennett said that he would mobilize the rest of the world to take on China together. Dan?
Yeah, Yang Gang didn't get too much time last night, Jess.
No, not at all.
Yeah, now I appreciated you highlighted that it does seem like the consensus today is that Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg were winners.
Right.
But also I'm seeing so many tweets about how it was not a good night for Biden and not for Sanders. Kind of the older fellows didn't really come across so well last night.
We did see this generational divide on the stage last night. That was very clear as these candidates went after Joe Biden. We saw that moment with Senator Harris, of course, but then we also heard from Congressman Swalwell, who really said that Biden needs to pass the torch. He went on about how the next generation needs to take over, but Biden says he's still holding on to that torch. So yeah, you did see the divide in the party between kind of this younger, up-and-coming generation and then the folks who have been there for decades.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that moment with Swalwell, actually. He is one of the handful of candidates that our colleague Rick Newman has had the chance to actually sit down with one-on-one in the last few months. And it's been interesting to hear about some of these candidates that you don't hear as much about. I mean, Swalwell, not at all a known name, kind of like Marianne, the candidate who said that, you know who I'm talking about.
Marianne Williamson.
Marianne Williamson,
The self-help author.
About calling New Zealand. But let me just ask you, if you do think, maybe it's Swalwell, maybe it was someone else, Jess, if you think any of the lesser names kind of really helped themselves last night and did anything big to give themselves a moment and maybe introduce themselves to people that have never heard of them.
You know, I think it was tough because you had so many big names in that debate last night. I think Senator Harris just was such a standout. And while she is a big name, she wasn't really among the top tier necessarily. She was probably in the tier 2 candidates as opposed to Biden and Warren and Sanders, who are polling ahead of her. And I think this was her opportunity to really push herself into that top tier and build some momentum. I think the first night we saw one of the lesser names stand out. We saw Julian Castro really stand out in the first night. But I think last night was tough for the kind of newcomers or the lesser known names to really stand out with so many big stars of the party on stage.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I look forward to more of these post games as we get more debates. We should start giving this recurring segment a name. So thank you, Jess.
No problem. See you later.